And I've heard a few people contrasting what we might hear from Janet Yellen around the short term and the direction of interest rates in the United States, and then the more long term, suggesting that maybe she'll be hawkish about the short term but dovish about the longer term, and, you know, we'll read into that what we will.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that these Fed conferences are incredibly academic. And so we've had a few instances where Fed chair people have actually provided some policy insight. I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to get any from Janet Yellen. As Michael mentioned, we're getting a slew of data in the U.S. Before the September 21st meeting. So I think that the most we'll probably get is that everything is data dependent, and they'll be watching the data carefully. So I think that the markets might be disappointed. We saw that the U.S. dollar is flat, for example, today. I don't think we'll get much hint from Janet Yellen's speech.
Well, that's interesting. We've got a great story on the Bloomberg today. Master of the Universe flummoxed by Fed as Yellen takes the stage. It seems there's a lot of expectation in the bond markets in particular. I've got a chart here coming from that story about volatility. Bond investors are numb to Fed messages, so just suggesting the way that the bond markets have not responded in the way that maybe the foreign exchange markets have to some of the more hawkish comments that we've been having coming through from various Fed officials. And that leaves markets sort of poised like coil springs, listening for any clues that we get from Janet Yellen to bridge gaps in understanding about where the Fed goes. But that could all be for naught, you suggest.
That's right. I think we'll all continue to try to read the tea leaves. But Janet Yellen has never painted herself into a corner when she didn't need to, when she didn't need to prime the markets. And I don't think she needs to prime the markets at the moment, particularly given how much data we'll be getting. I don't think the Fed itself knows what they're going to do on September 21st just yet. So I think she'll do what she does best, which is to say something for everyone and buy herself a lot of wiggle room.
And you point out rightly that this is an academic event. The title of the symposium is Designing Resilient Monetary Policy Frameworks for the Future. It sounds like an absolute belter of a symposium. But they do sometimes, as Mike was suggesting, throw up comments about direction of policy. How much will we learn about divergent policy across the Atlantic, or perhaps more importantly across the Pacific, because there are many around the world waiting to find out how divergent US policy can get from the rest of the world?
That's right. That might be discussed. I think the most important discussion will be what the new framework for monetary policy will be going forward in the medium to long term. And I think actually there's a lot of convergence on that across central banks, and that the Fed, the ECB, the BOJ, they all think we need a new framework for monetary policy, but none of them know exactly what it should look like.
And what does that mean? What's broken at the moment?
So instead of targeting inflation and unemployment, for example, when we live in a world with such a low neutral rate, we need to target other things. So some have suggested we need to target higher inflation. Right now is not a great time to increase that target because we can't even hit the lower one. So in the short term, that's not really a credible option, but maybe in the medium to long term, and now is the time to discuss that. Targeting nominal GDP is another idea. I don't think that's materially different for most central banks than what they're already targeting, officially or unofficially.
Central bank independence could be something that's discussed as well, because whilst that was seen in the 90s and the 2000s as something that was, you know, almost religiously defended. Now, not many voices are saying we need to have non-independent central banks, but there are questions being asked about how fiscal policy needs to respond to what monetary policy has been doing. Is coordination a gentle chip away at that kind of independence, or is coordination okay? And then that takes us into dangerous helicopter money territory, I suppose.
So that's right. For the Fed in particular, independence is really sacred, more so, I think, than for other central banks, major central banks at least. And so I think this will be a big discussion, particularly in light of helicopter money and the fact that I think, you know, Japan will probably engage in helicopter money over the next 12 months. The ECB may well follow. If governments aren't willing to provide the fiscal stimulus that we need, then central banks might have to kind of co-opt it and engage in helicopter money, which really confuses fiscal and monetary policy and impinges on central bank independence.
We'll talk a little bit more about the comments we've had from Mark Mobius about Japan and the possibility of helicopter money as we go through the programme, Megan. But sticking with the United States, this all takes place, this Jackson Hole, Wyoming symposium takes place in the run-up to the US elections in November. Do you think the politics is playing out here? Certainly when you're talking about independence, Donald Trump has not been quiet about independence of central banks.
That's right. So the Fed is also concerned about its independence, particularly in light of a Donald Trump victory, because he said he'd like to audit the Fed, which would absolutely strip away independence for the central bank. And I do think that the Fed would like to avoid being seen to potentially influence the outcome of the election. And so I think that will influence Fed policy in September in the run-up to the elections. And then in December, I think we'll have a whole lot of policy uncertainty regardless of who wins, and that could influence the Fed's rate path as well.